So a for loop, let's actually talk about what a for loop is. And so what are loops? I think you're all probably familiar with loops, even though you probably don't think about it too much. An example is, let's say you listen to a song, you really like that song, and you want to binge on it for a little while, and so you put it on repeat. And that song repeats over and over again until finally you can't stand it anymore and you move on. That's a loop, just having a song repeat over and over again. And in fact, my 7-year-old daughter loves to do that, to the point where I just can't stand certain songs anymore because she's ruined them, even though because she just listens to the same thing over and over and over again. That's a loop. But in programming, what we mean by a loop is we want to repeat the same actions over and over again, basically the same lines of code. And so we use loops to repeat lines of code over and over again. Java has a couple of types of loops. The one we're specifically going to look at today is called a for loop. And a for loop, specifically in Java, looks like for some variable in some kind of list, a colon, just like an if, it has a colon, just like a function has a colon, and then we indent, right? And then you have the body of the loop. Right, and remember, that indentation is the body of the loop. And two or four indents. And basically, again, just like an if statement, you have that colon and then that indentation. Remember, that indentation is super important in Python. If you have something, as an example, I helped a student earlier today. He had a return in an if statement. Actually, no, a loop. He was actually playing, I think, with the step-it code. He had a return statement, and he couldn't figure out why the loop only ran one time. It's because this, when you call return, it automatically ends the function or the code. And he called return inside of a loop, and the loop only ran one time. And it was strictly just an indentation problem. So you can be very, very careful about your indentations. Python is very picky about indentations. And so what's going to happen here is the body of this loop is going to run based on the number of elements in the list. So there's a some number of elements in this list, right? So say there's 10 elements in the list. Every time in the list, one of those elements is going to go in that variable, that var, and then the body of the loop is going to get executed, which means if 10 elements in the list, it's going to run 10 times. And so that's what's going to happen in there. And in another language, not Java, not Python, because Python only has the one type of for loop. In other languages, you might hear this called the for each loop. So really what you're saying here is for each thing in this list, let's run the loop. And so that's kind of what it's saying. This is not really called a for each loop in Python, but for those of you who may know Java, there's a for each loop in there. C++ doesn't really have it, but some other languages do. So let's actually look at a list. So let's do a list of odd numbers. Now I have a list. And I want to access each and every element in the list, and I just want to print them out. So I type a for loop. Remember the colon. The indentation happens automatically here in idle, but when I hit enter, it's going to run the loop, and this variable n is going to get filled in one at a time. So the first time through the loop, we call that an iteration when the loop runs each time the loop runs, it's called an iteration. So each time through it. So the first iteration, n is 1, and then the 1 printed out. And then n is 3, and it printed out the 3. N is 5, prints out the 5. Then n is 7, prints out the 7. N is 9, it prints out the 9. So each time through the loop, it grabs the next element. And then once we hit 9, that's it. We're done. There's nothing left. And so that loop will end when there's nothing left in the list. We can do other things with this information. Let's say same loop, but this time instead of printing out n, Let's actually square it. When we run this, we get 1 times n is, n to the 2 is still going to be 1. 1 to the 2 is 1. 3 to the 2 is 9. 5 to the 2 is 25. 7 is 49. 81 to the 2 is, 9 to the 2 is 81. So each iteration, again, n gets replaced by each individual number as it runs through the list. Now, we don't have to define a variable for the list. We can define the list directly. So here's the even numbers. And let's just multiply these by 2. And it did 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. 6 times 2 is 12. 8 times 2 is 16. So it just runs through. And let's actually look at what this code is doing. That's and the best way to actually understand how a loop works is actually through a table. So we have this loop, and how this works. And so remember, we have this concept of an iteration. An iteration basically is how often the body runs. That's one iteration. And the body runs again, that's another iteration. And there's going to be 4 iterations, right? There are 4 elements in this list. There are 4 iterations. And then we have this lm variable. And through each iteration, what's going to happen is you're going to get 2, the first element. It's going to print it. And just so that we see, I'm going to have the output over here, just so we can see what happens. So the first time through, we have 2 times 2. The output's going to be 4. And then the second iteration, lm is 4. We get 4 times 2, we get 8. In the third iteration, we get the 6. 6 times 2 is 12, so it prints out 12. And then the fourth iteration, we get 8. 8 times 2 is 16. And then, we stop. When we hit the end, so we basically look for every element in the list. When we hit the end, we're done. There's nothing more to do. And so we stop. It's usually when you're trying to figure out what a loop is doing, usually a good idea to draw a table. Just so that you can see every iteration what's happening. And so that's really the basics of a for loop. Obviously, we're going to be doing a lot more with it, but that's the start.